We live in an environment where visual traps are everywhere. You scroll your feed, watch a show, or just walk down the street, and you are bombarded with hypersexualized content. It's an unavoidable feature of the modern digital landscape. You likely want to live a clean life and keep your mind pure, but navigating this landscape feels like walking through a minefield, especially when the triggers are built directly into the platforms you rely on for work and connection. When you inevitably stumble, the default reaction is almost always the same. You grit your teeth. You rely on raw willpower and make a quiet vow to simply try harder next time. This chart diagrams the behavioral loop that believers get trapped in. This is the guilt cycle. Notice how it always starts with an external media trigger that leads straight into a state of temptation. Once that temptation crosses the line into a lingering thought or a physical action, you hit failure. And right on its heels comes a heavy, paralyzing dose of shame and guilt. Trying to fight that guilt by doubling down on willpower just resets the board. You vow to be stronger, which puts you right back in the path of the next trigger. White knuckling is a structural flaw. It relies on the very resource that the initial trigger depleted. Having these thoughts or slipping up doesn't mean you are a lost cause. The very fact that you are wrestling with these questions shows your conscience is active. A person who has completely given up wouldn't feel this internal friction. That friction comes from a works-based mentality. This is the false promise that absolute purity and human perfection can be earned through strict discipline and a clean track record. If salvation relied purely on a flawless track record of good works, absolutely no human being would qualify. Not even globally recognized figures of holiness could earn their way in on actions alone. Managing modern temptation requires dropping the illusion of flawless willpower. You need a system that separates how you handle the guilt of your mistakes from how you build better habits for the future. To weigh different spiritual strategies for managing sin, we use this matrix, starting with the work strategy. The primary input requires intense self-discipline and flawless behavior. Because the standard is absolute purity, failure is inevitable. You cannot maintain a perfect record indefinitely. The mental trade-off is severe. You exchange peace of mind for constant anxiety. Every slip-up keeps you in bondage to guilt, afraid one wrong look ruins your standing. The works model traps you in a zero-sum game you cannot win. You must find a different mechanism to handle the guilt of inevitable failure, one that doesn't rely on your own perfection. Next is justification, designed specifically to manage the guilt of failure. The input is entirely different, confessing your failure through prayer and accepting Christ's sacrifice as payment. The outcome is an immediate spiritual reset. God sees you through the complete purity of Jesus. In the Old Testament, people constantly offered animal sacrifices to clear their ledger. Christ's sacrifice was final, covering all your mistakes in one single act. The psychological relief of this is immense. You are letting go of the exhausting attempt to save yourself and accepting an entirely unearned gift. Embracing this grace disarms the primary weapon used against you. The enemy wants you trapped in guilt, believing you are a total sinner, so you repeat the action. Justification solves your spiritual standing and removes the shame. But it doesn't automatically filter your social media feed. For that, you need the second tool. This is sanctification, the behavioral half of the framework focusing entirely on managing your daily physical environment. The input requires a strict media audit, cutting out the hypersexualized entertainment that acts as your primary trigger. It also requires proactively replacing those inputs. You have to renew your mind by consistently reading, studying, and meditating on Scripture. The long-term outcome is a gradual mental renewal. As your inputs change, your mind adapts, and your vulnerability to visual traps decreases. The trade-off is difficult. You sacrifice immediate dopamine hits of popular culture for delayed mental clarity. Unlike justification, sanctification isn't instant. It is a lifelong, daily grind to build physical and mental guardrails. Sanctification is the vital process of engineering your environment. You curate your inputs today to avoid encountering a trigger you aren't prepared to handle tomorrow. To figure out what's missing, we map these concepts onto a quadrant chart, tracking grace against discipline. In the bottom left is the guilt-burdened believer. With low discipline and low grace, they obsess over single failures, convinced they're destined for punishment. If that's you, understand your struggle proves your heart is convicted. Lean into justification. Up in the top left is the passive consumer. With high grace but low discipline, they accept forgiveness but refuse to moderate their screens. Relying on grace without auditing your environment is active self-sabotage. The top right quadrant is the sustainable path. It uses grace to fuel discipline, turning the guilt cycle into a process of long-term development. Overcoming modern temptation is impossible if you treat your faith as a test of flawless willpower. The environment is stacked against you, and human discipline has limits. When you fail, deploy justification. Use prayer to reset your standing and stop the downward spiral. Concurrently, deploy sanctification. Ruthlessly audit your digital diet and cut the triggers to build long-term resistance. Lasting peace requires two things. Trade the pride of self-reliance for grace, and embrace the daily grind of curating your mind.